August 1953. A television phenomenon is coming to a close. The Quatermass experiment was a legendary piece of television that proved to be highly influential and popular. The success of this six-part sci-fi serial was unprecedented for the time, with an average of 3.9 million viewers and a total of 5 million for the final episode. The year before the broadcast, the Times had estimated that the total television audience was about 4 million people. Whereas they had previously worked together on a BBC production called Arrow to the Heart the previous year, this was the first major collaboration between Isle of Man-born writer Nigel Kneale and Austrian director Rudolf Cartier. The television company realised what potential these two could have and realised that they were a collective force to be reckoned with. In this particular month, the BBC commissioned them with their next project, which proved to be a Herculean and highly complex effort, with even Kneale himself saying that it was a complicated script even for them. Following a needed postponement of a release date because of the nature of the production, British television audiences were harrowed by an extraordinarily ahead of the time piece of broadcasting on the 12th of December 1954. I am of course talking about the notorious adaptation of George Orwell's totalitarian dystopian sci-fi 1984. The following part, as found within Into the Unknown, The Fantastic Life of Nigel Kneale by Andy Murray, I feel acts as an adequate induction of the cataclysmic reaction that happened. It worked, recalls Kneale. It all worked. It was totally successful. And the next day there were screams of horror in the newspapers. What are they doing to us? Making us look at live rats. What are they doing to this poor, innocent British audience? That was the tone we got from all the newspaper reaction. Whole pages of denunciation. Peter Cushing had to disconnect his telephone. I had to hide. We all had to get out. The BBC said, "Don't answer the phone until further instruction." Any word you can think of that is similar to disgust and or horror is probably applicable to what people felt whenever they had watched a piece. The Room 101 scene was a particular offender. A political reaction happened as well, with discussions in Parliament about the teleplay occurring. At the time, because of this being the era of live broadcasts, programmes were often re-performed wholly in order to act as a repeat. One such occurrence for 1984 was highly debated as to even if it would go ahead because of the reaction to it. Nonetheless, it did, and this outing was tele-recorded, thankfully preserving the piece as this did not happen on the first transmission. Both this adaptation, along with Kneale and Cartier's version of Arrow to the Heart, were a part of a series called Sunday Night Theatre, which ran from 1950 through to 1959, an example of a trend of TV programs that was prominent in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s. Whenever television started becoming more widespread and accessible, it was initially used for influence of the public opinion and news broadcasts. However, when entertainment programs started to creep in and be shown via this method, it is likely that there were many shows that were effectively the medium telling the masses they could get a similar experience from the comfort of their own home as they would with the theatre or cinema, by using words synonymous with those other entertainment methods in their titles. These were anthology series with episodes of varying lengths in a likely emulation of the experiences at the theatre, for example, being standalone. It would be a difficult and almost impossible task to list every single one, but here are some major examples of these kinds of shows. I have already mentioned Sunday Night Theatre, but I would like to have an appendices here, as it is worth mentioning that episodes from it, It Is Midnight, Dr. Schweitzer, and The Lady from the Sea are among the earliest preserved pieces of British television, with the latter predating the first episode of the Quatermass experiment by 2 months, and I think Dr. Schweitzer is perhaps even earlier than The Lady from the Sea also. This also allows me to mention that the 1984 production runs to 113 minutes as per the BFI Blu-ray, and generally set a precedent for the realism and tough viewing that quite a few of these shows were. 1968 saw another Nigel Kneale piece, this being his prediction of reality television with the year of the Sex Olympics. This was produced underneath a series called Theatre 625, which a couple years earlier saw his adaptation of 1984 be screened again, but with some alterations to the script and cast changes. Both were thought to be lost for some time, but the former was found in the 1980s as a black and white print. The teleplay in question was originally in colour, and the latter got announced as being recovered in 2010 with a damaged print that has about 7 minutes missing. The Wednesday play ran from 1964 through to 1970 and featured several Ken Loach films, including Kathy Come Home, which dealt with homelessness, unemployment, and the rights of mothers to keep their own children. It had a huge impact on the 12 million people that watched it because of a very realistic documentary aesthetic. The series also saw the horrifying Peter Watkins piece The War Game, which was withheld from public broadcasting for almost 20 years. A big example prominent from 1970 until the mid-80s was the BBC's Play for Today series. I have already mentioned on this channel both Pender's Fen and the adaptation of Alan Garner's Redshift, both of which were made as installments to this show. Other noteworthy productions were Scum and Brimstone and Treacle. Both were initially banned from being broadcast and subsequently both got remade as cinematic films. There was also a folk horror themed entry of Robin Redbreast, which is sometimes seen as a precursor to The Wicker Man, Edna the Inebriate Woman, which so happened to be produced by the second big name of this video, another hard-hitting piece of realism that led to debate as to what it showed, and a 1976 production called Nuts in May that the BFI ranked 49th in a 100 greatest British television programmes list. These are just some of the 306 episodes produced for this particular series. I think it could be fair for me to say that Armchair Theatre was perhaps the titan of these kinds of shows, just thinking about how big of a spider's web of various programs and episodes it is. In of itself, it was a very large one in terms of how many episodes were produced total. However, many successes it would have at the time would naturally lead to spin-off shows and shows that were spawned out of it. For example, an episode broadcasted in 1967 called A Magnum for Schneider would act as the pilot episode for the hit spy series Callan. One of my favourite TV shows of the 1960s and 1970s, Out of the Unknown, started in this show as well. However, unlike Callan, the story of it being created and what led to it is much more lengthy and complex, which is what I aim to focus on here today. According to Wikipedia, Armchair Theatre ran for 18 years almost perfectly, with it being screened from the 8th of July 1956 to the 9th of July 1974. It overall clocks up 426 episodes, with approximately 168 of these preserved today. Due to the time span of the programme, it had both live performances of installments and the now more typical pre-recorded episodes. It adapted the works of literature, stage plays, and also included original scripts. Pulling a chunk out of the aforementioned website for a moment, the series was launched by Howard Thomas, head of ABC at the time, who argued that television drama is not so far removed from television journalism, and the plays which will grip the audience are those that face up to new issues of the day, as well as the problems as old as civilization. The original producer of the series was Dennis Vance, who was in charge of the first 2 years. In its early years, the series drew heavily on North American sources. The first play, The Outsider, was a medical drama adapted from the stage play by Dorothy Brandon, which was transmitted live on the 8th of July 1956 from ABC's Manchester studios in Didsbury. Early on into the run, a name which will become a bit more relevant later on that appeared on the production of the show was Sidney Newman. They succeeded Vance and became ABC's head of drama in April 1958. Unfortunately, things went catastrophically wrong for Newman not very long into their tenure, with an episode performed live at the end of November that year. It was simply titled Underground. This was a science fiction story by James Forsyth and depicted survivors of a nuclear holocaust taking refuge in the London Underground. In the interim of a break, 33-year-old actor Gareth Jones started to complain of feeling unwell. This was the recollection of the incident from another actor of the production, Peter Bowles. During transmission, a little group of us was talking on camera while awaiting the arrival of Gareth Jones's character, whom had some information for us. We could see him coming up towards us, but we saw him fall. Jones's character within the story was due to die of a heart attack, and in an unbelievable twist, the actor died on set due to the very same cause of death during the transmission break. Sidney Newman ended up instructing the director to shoot the remainder, quote-unquote, like a football match, and with the actors improvising and some rapid rethinking, the play was completed and finished. The co-workers of Gareth on set were not informed of what happened until afterwards, due to fears of them not being able to perform knowing what had just occurred. Due to this being a live performance, it was not recorded and it is unlikely that it will ever be found. However, it is safe to say that recordings of select performances from the show were being done at this time. A production from earlier on in the same month titled The Greatest Man in the World is preserved, for example. The director of this episode, Ted Kotcheff, would continue to have a very varied and impressive career in both the television and film industries. Other episodes of Armchair Theatre he directed include Lena Oh My Lena, The Emperor Jones, After the Show, The Hard Knock, No Trams to Lime Street from the 1950s, The Bird, the Bear and the Actress, The Greatest Man in the World, and probably some others that I have missed. He also contributed to BBC Sunday Night Play and Play for Today, amongst several other shows. For some of his film career, he directed First Blood, aka the first Rambo movie, Joshua Then and Now, 1985, North Dallas 40, 1979, and Weekend at Bernie's, 1989, for example. Irene Shubik would join the team on Armchair Theatre as story editor in 1960, following a meeting with Sidney Newman, which occurred due to an encounter with Kotcheff. My information for a lot of this episode is sourced from 2 books, one being Mark Ward's incredible volume on Out of the Unknown, with myself mainly honing in on information from the first chapter, Out of the Armchair. Here it details that the first 3 scripts edited by Shubik all became very highly respected pieces of television. These were Where I Live by Clive Exton, A Night Out by Harold Pinter, and After the Funeral by Olin Owen. Along with these, she was able to meet a considerable legend in the realms of science fiction and horror television, Rod Serling. Shubik was able to purchase the rights to a play about US trade unionism by Serling entitled The Rank and File in 1961. Things for an Armchair Theatre adaptation of this originally 90-minute play seem to line up just right. Rod's stories Come in Razor Red and Noon on Doomsday had previously been adapted for the show, and Irene herself was a fan of The Twilight Zone. Shubik submitted a 54-minute version for approval to the author and received a congratulatory telegram back. It was transmitted at the end of 1961, right before an actors' strike halted production on the series. As alluded to, Armchair Theatre was not bound by genre. It often got saddled with the term kitchen sink drama for describing this aspect of what the productions were generally about, however, which was a cultural movement that formed in Britain in the 1950s and 1960s that often featured male protagonists disillusioned with modern society. As such, contemporary dramas were a big thing done in the show, but the likes of crime dramas, mystery dramas, and science fiction teleplays were done also. By the early 60s, the show had already tackled a genre of science fiction and ways of using it. At times, however, elements of the story type were used to further accentuate the social edge of proceedings during the production, rather than full-on sci-fi stories. Two major examples of these being The Greatest Man in the World and The Man Out There, both of which starred Patrick McGoohan. I probably don't need to mention that this actor later went on to play the lead in the iconic countercultural series The Prisoner in the late 1960s, which, incidentally, used the same music cue that Out of the Unknown Series 4's titles did within a particular sequence in the notorious finale, Fallout. Since I so happen to have both on DVD, these two examples were ones that I decided to watch and write about. In the mid-1950s started what is known as the space race, a famous competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to achieve superiority in regards to spaceflight. Examples of major events from it are Yuri Gagarin becoming the first man in space and the iconic moon landing by the US in 1969. Whereas The Greatest Man in the World is an adaptation of a short story from the 1930s, in my interpretation it is a teleplay that tries to capitalize on the zeitgeist of the space race and does it all to great effect. The plot is set during this major moment of the geopolitical power game that is the Cold War, and shows political heads of the United States in a wild exultation upon the discovery that an American was able to successfully become the first man on the moon, in the course of an unofficial and largely anonymous space mission. The cast are excellent. Jack Smirch, the astronaut that is more discussed than featured, as played by Patrick McGoohan, is an extremely well realised character and is often funny and completely unhinged. A prime example of this is him being proud of being the first person to vomit on the moon. It's also likely that the broadcast uses this character in the aspects of, we have this hero to represent our country and this achievement it has made, but in regards to the integrity of our public image, is this the hero we really want? The other acting highlight for me was the President of the United States as played by Donald Pleasence, whom horror fans may recognise as Samuel Loomis in the first 5 Halloween films. Another excellent performance whose character is written very well in regards to handling situations bestowed upon him and figuring out what to do when put in a corner. I overall thought this was a really engaging piece of television, and whereas the following was already on the cards for a watch for this documentary, it made me more interested in checking out The Man Out There. This next one, as originally broadcasted on the 12th of March 1961, very much can act as a companion piece to The Greatest Man in the World. as it also showcases an event set within the space race, but from the opposite side this time, with a space mission conducted by the Soviets. Patrick McGowan again features as an astronaut, which characters refer to him as Troika, but the end credits simply as the man, on a space mission which is ultimately successful in getting him outside of planet Earth. But due to a technical malfunction, he becomes stranded. Back down on Earth, Mary McFarland is in attendance of an extremely sick and feverish child on the brink of death. Upon trying to contact a doctor through radio, they end up establishing a communication link with the marooned Troika, who so happens to be trying to get into contact with ground control. Can either of these people be saved? Personally for me, I would have said that this is one of the lesser quality episodes that I have seen at the moment, The Criminals and A Magnum for Schneider being among my favourites, but I can definitely appreciate a lot of what it is going for. I am uncertain of the critical reception the programme had at the time, as the book on the show that I have does not cover it, but I can imagine it being quite significant and one that would have been talked about, as Yuri Gagarin's mission was successful just a month later. Timely indeed. As mentioned, this was a very large TV programme, with 18 years of life and over 400 episodes. In turn, there are many installments that probably could somehow fit into and be discussed in my documentary. Several of these are missing episodes, however, but fortunately there are some very relevant ones that are still preserved, one of these being The Invasion from March 1963. My mentioning of it here will make for a jump and disruption of chronology, however, as it was broadcasted in between two major televised events for this video, one of these being Out of This World, the title sequence music of which was homaged with some bits of the score here. Nonetheless, and despite this, I think it is a necessity to mention it, as Irene Shubik herself likes it. It is one of the most exemplary outings into the areas of science fiction that Armchair Theatre did, which still exists. It showcases an early look into some of the more comedic leanings of Out of the Unknown, and I can recommend it very highly in a contextualization of the history of Out of the Unknown. What is generally an eccentric 55 minutes of television follows the couples of Mr. and Mrs. Hedgehacker and Mr. and Mrs. Fairprice. The cousin of one of these people has died, and they and their partner are arranging a grand funeral proceeding as a send-off. However, blackmail, fighting, and a general hatred of one another between the two teams begins to sully and disrupt the plans. In the background, a school kid and his classmate are adamant that they have been able to decode an alien transmission through radio waves. They are ignored and cited as just kids being kids with their overreactive and hyper imaginations. These two plot articulates eventually merge at the end of the piece during a live television broadcast, where it turns out an alien invasion has indeed been successful. As cited in the DVD booklet, the play is quite satirical and comedic. Some of the latter elements washed over me for the most part, however. I think perhaps I cringed a little at the "what room" line after a waiter saying that Burgundy needs to be at room temperature for best results as a side note / example. However, I did definitely pick up on and understood the satirical undercurrents that ran throughout the episode, with the overall message being interpretable as, we are too wrapped up in trivial, at times, and everyday life to the point of ignorance to something massive happening around us. The message here sounds like something one may bring up in our current technology and social media dominated society when talking about our screen time, so perhaps in that regard, Armchair Theatre The Invasion could be viewed as relevant. The climactic ending as well was very commendable from a writing perspective. Throughout the episode, we get subtle and frequently less subtle glimpses of the aliens leading up to the ending. As viewers, we can see them more than the human characters as we are paying attention, unlike the Earthlings. The character of Lady Corm seems to notice them, but is either generally too stupid to speak up about them, or when she does say something, it sounds like something that could very well be racist. Overall, whereas not everything landed for me, I still found myself enjoying this piece of television drama a lot. Generally, I think there will be a refrain from numerical ratings in this presentation, but for me this stands pretty solidly at an 8 out of 10. If you're interested in the history of Out of the Unknown, then I would recommend watching this episode. Since we don't have some of the comedic leanings of that show preserved, like The Prophet and Get Off My Cloud, not to mention the tycoons from Out of This World, this makes this surviving entrant a very interesting document that I felt was very ripe and adequate for discussion here, not to mention that it is a great piece of television generally. The third and final big name that I would like to mention in this documentary is Leonard White. They acted as a producer for many episodes of the main show in this video's current phase, and in turn several of the precursory programs to Out of the Unknown. Upon his joining of the company of ABC, one of his first assignments was to take reins as producer of a show entitled Inside Story, and in turn worked on the last 9 episodes of its 13 installment run. After this, Leonard was tasked with creating a 13 episode run of Armchair Theatre to occupy a summer span in 1960. However, due to Sidney Newman being quite protective of this show and the aim of attracting a different audience, the result of this was the spin-off Armchair Mystery Theatre, and it focused on crime and mystery stories. A second series would eventually follow in 1964, followed by another in 1965. Not a lot of the episodes are known to exist, comparatively, of the overall 34 episode run of this particular show, as 25 are missing according to Wikipedia. An artifact of these preservations is an approximately 20-minute extract from an episode that had to be stopped midway through filming, as the crew had run out of studio time. Interestingly enough, this production was called And Where It Stops. Another interesting thing that I would like to note, which Wikipedia also does, is a production screened on the 11th of December 1960. This being Armchair Theatre, The Cupboard. Apparently, this was scheduled to be included in the first series of this mystery spin-off, but was delayed because a real-life murder mirrored plot details within this installment. Donald Pleasence would act in this transmission fittingly enough, as he was also utilised as a host to introduce stories in this first spin-off. This is an episode of Armchair Theatre which is preserved and is on YouTube. It seems like the ABC were planning for a second run of this spin-off to be broadcasted in 1962. However, due to the producer of it, Leonard White, being busy with producing the first series of The Avengers, which was being done in a very tight schedule, and with it being screened through the entirety of 1961, it seems like this intent was muddied somewhat. In turn, Irene Shubik was able to sneak in and propose a science fiction spin-off of Armchair Theatre to fill in this gap of uncertainty. What is seen as a help in the making of this decision was broadcasted on the 3rd of December 1961, Murder Club. This was another science fiction tinged episode and an adaptation of the short story The Seventh Victim by Robert Sheckley. Actor Richard Breers played a serial killer in the year 2110, where social elevation is brought by murder and allows for new angles for television programming. Sheckley's novel, Immortality Inc., would later be adapted as the first episode of the third series of Out of the Unknown. In front of me, I have a movie tie-in addition to a 1990s adaptation that was entitled Free Jack. When it was decided to make this spin-off, a production block of 14 sci-fi episodes under the title Out of This World were shown in 1962. Upon a decision by Sidney Newman, one of these was torn off and shown as an episode of Armchair Theatre, followed by a trailer for the new show. The main series of now 13 episodes began with an adaptation of Rog Phillips's The Yellow Pill, then an adaptation of Little Lost Robot by Isaac Asimov, Cold Equations by Tom Godwin, and Imposter by Philip K. Dick were screened next.